It was early spring when I made my biggest mistake. I had been hiking and surviving in the wild for years, but this time was different. The wilderness, for all its beauty, had a way of reminding you that it didn't care how skilled you were. One miscalculation, one moment of overconfidence, and everything could go wrong. That's what happened to me that day. My name is Brad, and I've spent most of my life hiking, camping, and living off the land. I've been through deserts, mountains, and forests that most people only see on nature documentaries. I know how to build shelters, find food, and make sure I stay alive no matter how hard the conditions get. But that day, I let my confidence get the best of me. It started with a simple mistake, misjudging the distance to my next campsite. I had planned a 5-day trek through the northern forests of Canada, aiming to reach a remote cabin that had become somewhat of a tradition for me. It was a peaceful, rustic place where I could relax, refuel, and prepare for the rest of the journey. But I had underestimated how far I would need to go, assuming that my experience would guide me just fine. The first 2 days had been smooth sailing. The weather was mild, and I moved through the forest with ease. The land was familiar to me, and I felt no need to rush. By the time I reached what I thought was the halfway point, I was feeling confident. A little too confident. That's when I made the error that would cost me. I had crossed a small stream earlier in the day and had thought I saw the faint trail of a deer path that would cut through some of the denser woods. It wasn't marked on my map, but it seemed like a shortcut. I convinced myself that it would save me a couple of hours. I should have known better. I had seen it in the past, experienced hikers who get too cocky, taking shortcuts and thinking they know better than the land. Nature doesn't care about your experience. If you're not careful, it'll swallow you whole. By the time I realized the mistake, it was too late. I'd strayed too far from the main trail. The landscape had changed from soft, flat ground to dense underbrush that slowed my progress. I didn't have much time to assess it before the terrain became steeper and rockier. Still, I pushed on, convinced that I could figure it out. After all, I'd survived more challenging situations before. Hours passed, and the heat began to rise. The sun hung high in the sky, and the temperatures soared higher than expected for this time of year. I had planned for cooler conditions, but now I found myself sweating more than I anticipated. I hadn't packed enough water for a stretch like this. My canteen was running low, and I hadn't come across a stream in over an hour. I tried to push the worry out of my mind. I wasn't far from my intended campsite, or at least I thought I wasn't. But with each step, the trees grew thicker and the air heavier. The underbrush seemed to close in, and the once familiar sounds of the forest, birds, the wind rustling through the branches, grew muffled. All I could hear now was the pounding of my own heart and the occasional rustle of something large in the woods. Around noon, I stopped for a rest. Sweat dripped from my forehead, and I wiped it away with the back of my hand. My canteen was almost empty now, and the food in my pack was hardly enough for another day. The map I carried gave me no clear indication of where I was. I should have marked my progress more carefully, but the shortcut had distracted me. Now, all I had was the vague sense that I was deeper into the woods than I had planned. I decided to find water first. My stomach gnawed at me from hunger, but water had to come first. Without it, the rest wouldn't matter. I found a small depression in the ground that looked like it could hold water. I knelt down, but when I scooped up some dirt, I realized it was just a dry pit. I cursed under my breath and stood up. The heat was making my head spin, and my body felt heavier with every step. I was beginning to understand the gravity of the situation. I'd miscalculated how much time I had, how far I had wandered, and now I was in an area where natural water sources weren't easy to find. I needed to be smarter, more careful. The thought of turning back crossed my mind, but I was far past the point where I could retrace my steps easily. The terrain had become uneven, with sharp rocks and thick underbrush that made any backward progress slow and difficult. The idea of moving forward, though, felt like a better choice. Maybe I would find something just a little farther ahead. Hours went by, and I hadn't found any water. My tongue felt like sandpaper, and my head pounded with every step. I pushed forward, hoping for anything, that could help me get back on track. The sun was starting to dip below the trees when I finally spotted something that looked like it might help. A small creek, barely a trickle, but enough to satisfy my thirst. I dropped to my knees and cupped my hands in the water, drinking deeply. It wasn't much, but it was enough to calm my nerves. I refilled my canteen as best I could, though it was still far from full. I was no longer thinking clearly. My body was running on fumes, and the heat had taken a toll on my mental state. I had to push forward. It wasn't until after dark that I realized I hadn't found the campsite yet, and I still hadn't seen any sign of a familiar landmark. That was when the real anxiety hit. I realized I was in a race against time. The forest was dense, and nightfall would make it impossible to see anything. The temperature would drop, and I was already dangerously close to dehydration. I needed to find shelter, water, and food. I needed to get out before things got worse. I set up camp in a small clearing, with only the faintest light from my headlamp. The trees around me seemed to close in, their shadows long and ominous. I built a small fire to ward off the chill, but the smoke made my eyes sting. My food supplies were nearly gone, and the last of my water wouldn't last through the night. I had never felt so alone in the wilderness before. It wasn't fear of wild animals or the unknown. It was the crushing weight of knowing I had messed up. I wasn't just off course. I was lost. The following morning, I decided to stop wandering in circles. I knew I had to focus on getting out, and that meant staying calm. The anxiety was still there, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts, but I couldn't afford to let it take over. I marked my position with a small pile of rocks and began retracing my steps, making sure to check the landscape more carefully this time. By midday, I finally spotted a larger creek that I recognized. The relief was overwhelming. I followed it downstream, hoping it would lead me to a known trail or a better landmark. I followed the creek for hours, pushing my tired body through the thick undergrowth. The day dragged on, but with each step, I felt a bit more confident. Eventually, I stumbled upon a trail that led me to a well-marked route. The feeling of relief was indescribable, but it came with a sharp realization. I had gotten lucky. When I finally reached the main trail, I knew I had narrowly avoided a much worse situation. I made my way back to civilization, my body sore and battered but intact. I had learned something important. Never let your confidence blind you to the reality of the land. The wilderness had no mercy, and it could humble anyone, no matter how experienced they were. I've always been someone who enjoys a good adventure, especially when it involves the outdoors. So when a few friends and I decided to hike up to a secluded cabin deep in the mountains for the weekend, I was excited. It was supposed to be a peaceful trip, a chance to escape the noise of everyday life and reconnect with nature. We packed our bags, grabbed our gear, and set off early on a Friday morning. The weather was clear, the air fresh, and the anticipation high. Felt like nothing could go wrong, but that changed fast. The weather, which had been calm and sunny when we started to turn as we got higher up the trail. The first drops of rain were small and sporadic, nothing to worry about. But then it started to pour. The rain didn't just fall. It slammed into the ground, soaking us in minutes. The wind picked up, pushing the rain sideways, and the temperature dropped quickly. The trail we had been following became slick and muddy, the once clear path now a slippery mess of water and loose rocks. We weren't far from the cabin, just a few hours at most. But none of us had anticipated such a drastic change in the weather. The visibility dropped to nearly zero, the mist swirling around us like a thick curtain. We tried to push through, determined to reach shelter before the storm got worse. But the terrain, already challenging, became nearly impossible to navigate in the worsening conditions. The wind howled through the trees, and the trail quickly became indistinguishable from the landscape. Our group, which had started off strong, got split up quickly. I was with Jason and a couple of other friends, but we lost sight of the others within minutes. The sound of the storm drowned out everything else. We tried to yell for them, but the wind carried our voices away. Jason kept moving forward, urging us to follow him, but the further we went, the more lost we felt. Eventually, we stopped. It made no sense to keep going when we weren't even sure which direction we were heading in. We looked around, trying to spot any familiar landmarks. There was nothing, just endless trees, the rain, and the thick mist. We huddled together, trying to decide what to do. I checked the map and GPS, but it didn't help much. The trail had vanished under the deluge, and our tracks were already washed away. We were in unfamiliar territory now, with no clear path back to the trail. Jason seemed confident we could still find the cabin if we kept moving, but the rest of us weren't so sure. The fear of hypothermia was creeping in. Our clothes were soaked through, our teeth chattering, and we couldn't stop shivering. We had enough food for a day, maybe two, but not if we kept wandering like this. The next few hours were a blur of panicked movements, each of us growing more and more frustrated. The rain didn't let up, and it only seemed to get colder. The wet ground made every step harder, and with every direction we tried, it felt like we were only getting further away from our goal. At one point, Jason decided we should stop and make camp for the night. We had to conserve energy, he said. He found a small patch of trees to take shelter under, and we tried to set up a makeshift camp with what little gear we had. But the shelter was barely enough to keep us dry, and the cold seeped into our bones. The food we had was limited, and everyone knew we couldn't keep wasting it. The argument started quietly at first, just a few murmurs about what we should do next. But as the night wore on, the frustration and fear started to build. One of us wanted to keep going, convinced we could find the cabin if we just pushed through the storm. Another argued we should stay put and wait until morning. But none of us agreed. The tension in the air was thick, and as we sat in the dark, wet, and cold, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was going from bad to worse. By the time the storm was still raging outside, I couldn't tell how much time had passed. Couldn't sleep. The cold gnawed at me, and I spent what felt like hours staring into the dark, hoping to hear something, anything, to tell me we weren't completely alone out there. When morning finally came, it didn't bring much relief. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, but the mist was still thick, and the trees were heavy with water. We were all exhausted, hungry, and scared. Jason's optimism had faded, replaced by a quiet tension. The decision was clear now. There was no way we were getting back to the trail in these conditions. We would have to find shelter for another night. With no clear direction, we began to make our way forward, pushing through the brush, following the sound of running water in the distance. Every step felt like a gamble. The terrain was treacherous, and we slipped several times, each fall adding to the growing feeling of dread. Then, after hours of searching, we stumbled upon something. A small cabin. It wasn't the one we had been looking for, but it was shelter, something we hadn't dared to hope for. We cautiously approached, unsure if anyone was inside. But when we got closer, we could see it was abandoned. The door was slightly ajar, the windows dark and empty. We pushed it open, half expecting to find something unexpected inside. But there was nothing, just an old, dusty fireplace and a few broken pieces of furniture. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. We set up inside as best as we could. It wasn't comfortable, but it was dry, and it gave us a place to regroup. We started a fire using what dry wood we could find and huddled around it, finally able to warm ourselves. The food we had was enough for one more meal, and we rationed it carefully, knowing we couldn't afford to waste anything. The storm eventually passed, and the sun began to peek through the clouds, but the damage had already been done. We were lost, disoriented, and exhausted. The cabin was our only refuge, and we had no choice but to wait until the weather cleared enough to head back. The next day, we finally got our bearings. The storm had passed, and we could see the landscape more clearly. The trail wasn't far, and it only took a few hours of careful hiking to get back to a more familiar part of the woods. By the time we reached the nearest ranger station, we were relieved but battered, our clothes still soaked, and our bodies aching from the cold and exhaustion. I don't know what would have happened if we hadn't found that cabin. If we hadn't taken shelter, if we hadn't stopped and waited until the storm passed, I honestly don't think any of us would have made it out. That experience, terrifying as it was, taught me a lesson I'll never forget. Nature doesn't care about your plans. You can be prepared all you want, but when things go wrong, you have to make decisions fast, and sometimes just hanging on until the worst passes is the only option. We got lucky. That's the truth of it. We were lucky we found the cabin. Lucky we survived. And I'll never look at a storm the same way again. It was supposed to be a routine weekend camping trip for the troop. Just a quick overnight stay in the woods, far enough from town to enjoy nature, but close enough to hike back if anything went wrong. I'd been a scout leader for a few years, but I still remember the nerves I felt on the way there, like I had something to prove to the younger scouts. As the leader, I was supposed to stay calm and steady, setting the example. Little did I know, that night would put me to the test in ways I'd never imagined. We were deep in the ponderosa pine forests of Northern California, the scent of pine and fresh earth hanging thick in the air. The air was crisp, cool enough to need a jacket, but not enough to make us shiver. Perfect hiking weather. Our destination was a small cabin, one that had been used by various groups over the years. It wasn't glamorous by any means, but it offered shelter if we needed it. The scouts were excited, as usual, and that made the weight of responsibility on my shoulders feel that much heavier. I couldn't let anything go wrong. Not with these kids. That day had been full of promise. We'd spent most of the morning on the trail, climbing over rocks and through thickets of brush, the path weaving between old-growth trees that looked as though they'd been there for centuries. The scouts were in good spirits, joking around, the kind of carefree chatter you'd expect from a group of boys their age, eager to prove themselves. But everything changed when we took a short detour. We'd reached a point where I thought it would be a good idea to take a small break before heading further down the trail toward our destination. A few of the scouts wanted to climb up a ridge to get a better view of the forest, so I let them. I had walked off a little to check the map and adjust the route when the panic started. It was Carlos, one of the younger scouts, maybe 14 or 15. He'd been acting a little nervous earlier in the hike, but I figured it was just first-time jitters. He'd been clinging to the group, staying close to me, like he didn't quite trust the woods. At first, I thought he was just anxious about the height of the ridge or the slippery rocks. But then I heard him shout. He was running. I didn't know what had happened at first. I could only see a blur of movement through the trees, his dark figure darting between them like a wild animal. I didn't understand, not at first. He couldn't have been that scared of a few rocks. But there was something in his eyes when he glanced over his shoulder that told me this was more than just nerves. "Carlos!" I yelled, instinctively starting to chase after him. I didn't think much about the other scouts as I ran. My main focus was getting him back. Carlos was fast, though too fast for me. I had no choice but to follow him through the dense underbrush, hoping to catch up. The trail was narrow, winding in ways that didn't help. My legs burned with the effort to keep up, the uneven ground making every step feel like it could be my last. The sound of my breathing was louder than the forest around me, and that's when I realized things were wrong. By the time I found Carlos, he was at the edge of a drop. The trail had veered off the side of the ridge, and the ground below sloped down sharply toward a creek. Carlos had stopped at the edge of it, looking over his shoulder, his face pale. His eyes were wide, his breath coming in quick gasps. I could see the fear in him, more than just the fear of the trail. It was something deeper, something primal. "Carlos!" I shouted again, this time forcing my voice to stay steady. He didn't move. He just stood there, shaking. I couldn't let him stay there, not with the drop so close, not with him so close to panicking completely. I stepped forward slowly, my voice trying to calm the situation, though my own heart was pounding. I reached out, and that's when it happened. Carlos broke. He didn't hear me anymore. He didn't respond to anything. He turned and ran again, further off the trail, deeper into the forest. There was nothing I could do but follow him. We'd lost all sense of the trail by now, and the terrain was more challenging than ever. The trees were packed tight, their roots twisted into the earth like ancient hands grasping for something. The brush was thick, and every step seemed to lead me further off course. Carlos didn't stop. His panic was contagious, and before I knew it, I was out of sight of the rest of the group. As I sprinted after Carlos, I had a sinking feeling deep in my gut. I should have never let him wander off in the first place. By the time I lost sight of him again, the sun was beginning to dip low in the sky. I was starting to realize just how much trouble we were in. Carlos had led us off the trail, far from any recognizable landmarks, and now the light was fading fast. The woods weren't the same anymore. They felt suffocating, like they were closing in around me. The air was colder, and every step sounded too loud in the growing silence. I knew I couldn't chase him much longer. I had to get back to the rest of the group. The scouts needed to know what was happening. I turned around to head back to the ridge, hoping I could reorient myself. But that's when I realized everything looked the same. The trees, the rocks, the underbrush. It was all a blur, like I'd been walking in circles. The trail had disappeared entirely, and I had no idea where I was anymore. I pulled out my map, hoping to find some clue, but the darkness was creeping in faster now, the shadows stretching longer as the minutes slipped by. I tried to use the GPS on my phone, but of course, there was no signal, no map, no help. I was alone. The weight of it hit me then, the full responsibility of my role as a leader. I had let my guard down. I should have kept the scouts together. I should have never allowed anyone to wander off the trail. But now it was too late. I knew I had to get back to the group, but I had no idea which way to go. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and tried to steady myself. Couldn't panic. I had to stay calm for them. The next hour was a blur of frantic searching and growing desperation. I shouted Carlos's name until my throat felt raw, but there was no answer. There were no sounds in the forest but the rustling of leaves and the distant call of an owl. The dark was wrapping its fingers tighter and tighter around me. Then, through the gloom, I heard something, a faint cry, like a child calling out. My heart leapt. It was Carlos. I followed the sound through the trees, every step bringing me closer to his voice. But when I finally reached the spot where he'd been calling from, I found nothing. The forest was eerily quiet again. My mind raced. Had I imagined it? Had I been hearing things? Then I heard it again. A low sob, this time more distinct. I turned, and there he was, crouched under a tree, his face streaked with tears. He was shaking uncontrollably, his eyes wide with fear. I walked slowly toward him, my voice as calm as I could make it. I didn't want to spook him again. "We need to go back, Carlos," I said gently, though inside, I was scared out of my mind. I helped him to his feet, and we started walking back, both of us stumbling through the darkness, trying to retrace our steps. The forest felt colder, and I couldn't help but notice how much quieter it had become. The sounds of the wilderness were gone, replaced by the sound of our footsteps and our breaths. We finally stumbled back to the ridge, just as the first stars began to appear in the sky. The other scouts were waiting, huddled together near the cabin, their faces pale with worry. They rushed to us, relieved to see that we were okay. But I could see it in their eyes, they were shaken too. We made our way back to the cabin, and I kept telling myself that we were safe. But the fear didn't leave me. I knew we'd been lucky. We'd gotten off track, and things could have been much worse. The reality of the situation settled in, how fragile everything was out there in the woods. One wrong step, one moment of panic, and everything could change. By the time we were back inside the cabin, I had learned something I wouldn't forget. The forest wasn't a place to be taken lightly, and sometimes no amount of planning could save you from what it could throw your way. But we made it out, together, and in the end, that was all that mattered. We were supposed to be enjoying a simple hike through the woods, a break from the chaos of daily life. Just a few hours of fresh air, some time to connect with nature, and maybe a quick picnic before heading home. But that peaceful outing quickly turned into a nightmare. It was late fall, around mid-November, when my wife, Sarah, and I decided to take the kids on a hike through one of the national parks near our home. Our daughter, Lily, was 8, and our son, Jake, was 5. We picked a relatively easy trail, a loop that was known for its beautiful views and not too difficult for kids. The weather had been mild, and the forecast promised clear skies. We were looking forward to a day out, to let the kids burn off some energy, and for Sarah and me to enjoy a quiet walk. We started the hike early in the morning, with the sun still rising and the chill of the air making everything feel crisp and new. The trail was clearly marked at first, with signs that pointed the way and little wooden arrows on trees guiding us along the path. The woods were calm, the only sounds being the crunch of dry leaves beneath our feet and the distant calls of birds. The kids ran ahead, laughing, while Sarah and I lagged behind, enjoying the peace. It didn't take long for the trail to begin winding deeper into the woods. The trees grew denser, the ground became softer, and the path started to narrow. At first, it was nothing alarming. The kids loved it. They were fascinated by the way the light filtered through the canopy, casting dappled shadows on the ground. Lily asked about every bug and leaf she saw, while Jake was mostly preoccupied with trying to keep up with his sister. Sarah and I exchanged a few quiet words, keeping an eye on them as we moved forward. It was around lunchtime when things started to shift. We'd been hiking for a couple of hours, and the trail began to grow more rugged. The trees seemed to close in on us, and the markers became less frequent. The path, which had been well-trodden and easy to follow, now seemed less defined. I pulled out the map I downloaded on my phone, but the signal was spotty, and the GPS wasn't helping much. It wasn't an issue at first. I figured it was just part of the adventure, and we were still pretty sure of our direction. But after another hour, I noticed something odd. We had walked for quite a while, and yet we hadn't seen a single signpost or trail marker in what seemed like forever. The trees around us had started to look the same. The path was less visible, more like a vague idea of a trail, faintly etched into the underbrush. We passed through a thicket of pine trees that seemed to stretch on endlessly. It was then that I realized something wasn't right. "Where did the trail go?" Sarah asked quietly. She had noticed it too. The kids were now complaining, tired from walking so long, and the air was starting to feel cooler. I checked the map again, but it wasn't much help. The GPS was showing us moving, but the trail we were supposed to be on didn't seem to match up with what I was seeing. At first, I wasn't worried. We just wandered off course, I thought. Maybe we took a wrong turn without realizing it. There were side trails everywhere, and this was a national park. People came here all the time. The park rangers would be nearby, and surely the trail would appear again if we just kept going. But after an hour of walking and seeing nothing familiar, the doubt started to creep in. The kids were getting tired. Lily's face was flushed, her eyes wide with exhaustion, and Jake had stopped running ahead, instead clinging to Sarah's hand. His small voice was full of complaints, and it didn't help that the temperature was beginning to dip as the sun started to fall lower in the sky. "We're lost, aren't we?" Sarah asked, the panic in her voice impossible to ignore. She had started to notice it too. The woods felt different now, darker and quieter. The sunlight filtering through the trees seemed thinner, as if the air itself was holding its breath. I didn't want to admit it, but deep down I knew she was right. We'd strayed too far off the main trail, and now, with no clear path forward, we were stuck. "I'm sure we can find it," I said, trying to reassure her, though I wasn't convinced myself. "Let's just backtrack a bit and see if we can find where we went wrong." We turned around, walking in the direction we'd come from, but it didn't take long for the tension to rise. The woods around us seemed the same in every direction. No clear trail markers in sight, and our footsteps barely seemed to make a mark in the soft earth. It felt like the forest was swallowing us whole, making it harder and harder to find our way back. The kids were growing restless, their earlier energy completely drained. Lily was on the verge of tears, and Jake kept asking when we'd be home. Every minute that passed made me feel more helpless. The trees, the rocks, the fallen branches, they all blurred together, making everything feel unfamiliar. It was as if we were trapped in a maze that we couldn't escape. As the sun sank lower, the temperature dropped even further. We didn't have enough water left, and I realized we were running out of daylight fast. The reality of the situation began to settle in. We weren't just lost. We were potentially facing a night in the woods. I started to think about how long it would take for anyone to notice we were gone. The kids couldn't walk much longer, and we didn't have enough food for the night. My phone's battery was running low, and the map wasn't helping anymore. "I'm scared, Daddy," Lily said, her voice small and trembling. I knelt down beside her, trying to keep calm. "I know, sweetie. We're going to be okay. We just need to keep walking." But I didn't have a plan. There wasn't anything I could do but keep moving forward, hoping that anything would look familiar. Every step felt heavier. My legs ached, my stomach growled, and my mind raced through worst-case scenarios. What if we couldn't find the trail? What if we had to spend the night out here? The thought of the kids shivering in the cold, hungry and scared, made my stomach churn with dread. By now, the light was nearly gone. The forest seemed darker than it should have been, shadows stretching long across the uneven ground. I could hear the wind picking up, rustling the leaves in a way that sounded almost like whispering. Every snap of a twig made me flinch. I tried not to let fear show, but it was growing harder and harder to hide. We kept moving, though, trying to stay focused. We couldn't afford to stop now. Then, just as I thought I might break, I noticed something ahead, an old cabin. It wasn't much, just a small, dilapidated structure sitting against the backdrop of the trees. It looked like it had been abandoned for years, with vines creeping up its wooden walls and the roof sagging in places. But it was shelter, and at that moment it felt like a sign of hope. We approached cautiously, not knowing what we'd find, but knowing we couldn't go any further. The door was slightly ajar, and I pushed it open, the creak of the old wood echoing in the stillness. Inside, there was nothing but dust and cobwebs. A fireplace sat unused in the corner, and an old, cracked table lay beneath a grimy window. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than being out in the open. I gathered some dry wood from the surrounding area and managed to get a fire started, the small flames casting warm light in the dark cabin. The kids were exhausted, and despite the fear, they soon fell asleep near the fire, their faces tired and worn. We spent the night in that cabin, huddled together for warmth. Sarah and I stayed awake, listening to the sounds of the forest outside. Every now and then, I thought I heard something moving just beyond the cabin, but when I looked, there was nothing there. The wind moaned through the trees, and the silence of the woods pressed in on us, but we were safe, at least for the moment. The next morning, I woke up early. The sun had risen, casting a golden light through the windows of the cabin. The forest didn't seem as ominous as it had the night before. I knew we couldn't stay here long. We still had to find our way out. After some careful searching, I found a faint trail leading downhill. It wasn't much, but it seemed like the right direction. We followed it for several hours, moving slowly and cautiously. The kids were still tired, but they were strong, and we pressed on. By late afternoon, we finally found our way back to a main road, where a passing hiker helped us call for help. We were tired, dirty, and shaken, but we had made it out of the woods. That night, as we sat together at home, I realized how fragile our safety had been. We had made it out, but not without feeling the weight of what could have happened. The woods, as beautiful and peaceful as they seemed, were not forgiving, and I'd never take nature's power for granted again. We were lucky, but I knew it could have gone differently. I'll never forget that day. It reminded me that, no matter how simple or innocent the plan seems, nature doesn't care about your expectations. You need to respect it always, because it can turn on you in an instant. I had been planning this trip for months. Hiking through the Adirondacks with a group of friends seemed like the perfect way to spend the long weekend. We had all been talking about it for ages, but in the end, it didn't go anything like I'd imagined. Started off great. We arrived at the trailhead just as the sun was beginning to rise. The air was crisp, the sky clear, and we were all in high spirits. I was in my early 30s, Lena just a few years younger, and we had two other friends with us, Chris and Mia. Chris was the type of guy who liked to lead, always thinking he knew the best way. Mia, on the other hand, was more laid back, always trusting the rest of us to make decisions. I considered myself somewhere in the middle. It was supposed to be a relaxed trip, just a fun weekend getaway in the mountains. We started on the marked trail, which, as far as I could tell, was straightforward. The first couple of hours passed without any issues. We joked around, stopped for breaks, and admired the beauty of the forest around us. But then something happened, something I didn't notice until it was too late. We had veered off the main trail. It wasn't dramatic, but Chris, leading the way as usual, made a quick decision at a fork in the path. Seemed like a shortcut, and none of us thought twice. I remember glancing at my phone just before the signal dropped, but I didn't worry too much. I had no reason to think we were lost. But looking back, I should have noticed something was off. After a few more hours, I realized my phone was dead. I wasn't the only one. Chris and Mia's phones had also lost signal or shut down. First, we didn't panic. We assumed it was just a temporary setback, that we'd find a place to charge once we got back to the main trail. But when we stopped to rest and noticed that we had no idea where the main trail was anymore, the unease started creeping in. Dense forest around us, which had seemed so picturesque in the beginning, now felt suffocating. The trees were packed so closely together that the sunlight barely touched the forest floor, casting long, deep shadows. It was so quiet, too quiet, and it felt as if the woods were holding their breath, waiting for something. I remember looking at the map, but it was practically useless. The trails were too faint, and the GPS on my phone wouldn't work without a signal. Chris tried to stay calm, pointing to a vague trail on the map, but the more we walked, the more it felt like we were going in circles. The path had become so overgrown in places that we had to push through thick brambles, scratching our arms and legs in the process. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, the temperature dropped, and the tension between us grew. Chris, who had been confident at the start, was now clearly rattled. Mia, who usually went with the flow, was starting to show signs of worry. The silence among us grew thick, broken only by the occasional snap of a branch underfoot or the rustle of leaves in the wind. We were lost. Panic set in when we realized we couldn't retrace our steps. The more we thought about it, the more we understood just how dire our situation had become. No one had brought a compass. No one had checked the weather forecast thoroughly, and we had no way of contacting anyone. The hike was supposed to be simple. We never imagined we'd end up stranded in the middle of a forest with nightfall closing in. As the light faded, we all stood still, unsure of what to do next. Chris suggested pushing on, hoping that we'd stumble upon the trail eventually. But Mia didn't want to go any farther, convinced that we were just getting deeper into the woods. She was right, of course. None of us had any idea where we were going. It was then that we started arguing, each of us trying to push our own ideas on what to do next. At one point, Chris tried to take charge, as he always did, but his usual confidence was gone. He was pacing back and forth, muttering to himself. I could see the panic in his eyes, something I'd never seen in him before. Mia, typically the most calm of us, was now on the verge of tears. The tension in the group was unbearable. I tried to stay composed, but my heart was racing, my thoughts spinning in 1,000 different directions. We had food, water, and some basic gear, but no one had brought enough for an overnight stay. I knew we were all growing increasingly uncomfortable, but none of us dared to admit that it was already too late to turn back. The forest seemed to close in around us, the trees standing like silent sentinels, blocking any sign of civilization. When the first stars began to appear in the sky, it was clear we wouldn't be getting out tonight. The forest was dark, the shadows long, and the night air was cold. We huddled together for warmth, sitting on the ground and trying to make a plan, but none of us really knew what to do. The fear was palpable now, gnawing at the edges of our thoughts, and the darkness seemed to press closer with every passing minute. Chris wanted to keep moving, to try and find our way out, but Mia refused. She insisted we find shelter for the night, something to protect us from the elements. We argued back and forth, but in the end, I agreed with her. We had no choice but to wait until morning. So we gathered what little we could, using our backpacks to make a makeshift shelter, and started a small fire using the remaining matches we had. The fire was weak, flickering and crackling in the darkness. The wind whipped through the trees, and the night was full of strange sounds. Branches creaking, animals rustling in the distance. Every sound made my heart jump. I kept thinking I heard footsteps, but when I'd look, there was nothing. The longer we sat there, the more on edge we became. Mia, who had been quiet for a long while, spoke up. She suggested we should stay together, stay close. It wasn't just about survival, it was about holding on to something familiar. I knew she was right. The night felt like it was swallowing us whole. I kept my thoughts to myself, but I couldn't stop thinking about how easily we could have avoided this. If only we'd paid more attention at the fork in the path. If only we'd stayed on the marked trail. Now we were here, stuck in the middle of nowhere, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Around midnight, I thought I saw something, a flicker of movement between the trees. But when I tried to focus on it, there was nothing, just the cold, dark forest stretching out endlessly. It felt like the woods were closing in on us, like we were being encircled, trapped. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard something. Footsteps, whispers, the crackling of branches. I kept my hand on the knife I'd brought, just in case. But it was the waiting that gnawed at me. We had no way of knowing if we'd make it out alive. Morning didn't come quickly enough. The cold of the night seemed to cling to me, and I could feel it in my bones. But when the sun finally rose, it wasn't as much of a relief as I expected. The forest, bathed in the weak morning light, still felt endless, as though we were still trapped in the same place, no closer to safety. But then, as the day wore on, something changed. We kept walking, moving forward, hoping for any sign of civilization. After a few more hours of hiking, we finally stumbled upon an old, weathered cabin. It was a small, run-down structure with a tin roof and windows covered in grime. It looked abandoned, but it was a sign of life, something other than trees and dirt. We approached it cautiously, and to our relief, it was empty. Inside, we found a few basic supplies, canned food, firewood, and even a few old blankets. We started a fire and sat there, huddled together, grateful for shelter, for warmth, and for the chance to breathe again. We stayed there for a couple of days, using the supplies in the cabin and trying to stay calm. Eventually, we managed to find our way back to a trail, and by the time we were rescued, we were physically exhausted, but mentally, we had all changed. Looking back, it's hard to pinpoint what exactly went wrong, but we learned something valuable that day. How easily things can go off course, how fast you can go from being a group of friends out for a simple hike to being lost in the woods, fighting to survive. The forest had felt alive with danger, and we had been powerless against it. But in the end, we made it out. We had come together, despite our differences, and found a way to survive the night. I've always been the type of person who craves adventure, the type who is willing to go off the beaten path in search of something beautiful, something rare, something that might capture that perfect shot. I'm a photographer, and I've made a name for myself by finding those hidden places, those secluded pockets of nature that others overlook. But what I didn't realize that day, the day I went into the woods alone, was how far my obsession would take me. Started out like any other trip. The weather was perfect for hiking, cool but not cold. The sun still high in the sky. I had driven up to the Swiss Alps, looking for a quiet spot to snap a few photographs. There was a pond I had seen on an old map, tucked away deep in the forest, and I had a feeling it would be the kind of spot that could make my portfolio stand out. I had been there before, but only on a previous trip where I didn't stray far from the main trail. The pond was elusive, not well known, not marked on many maps, and I liked that about it. It was a hidden gem, and I wanted to capture that perfect moment when the light hit the water just right, the reflection of the trees distorted by a slight breeze. I was determined to find it. I packed my camera gear, loaded up my car with supplies, and set off early, not planning to return until I had the shot. The drive was peaceful, and the first few hours of the hike were beautiful. The woods here were dense, with towering trees that seemed to stretch forever into the sky. Birds sang above, and the scent of pine filled the air. But there was something unsettling about the silence of the forest, the way the usual sounds seemed to fade into the background. I wasn't worried, though. I had the GPS on my phone, and I knew I could count on it to get me to the pond. Or at least I thought I could. When I reached the edge of the forest, the path began to thin out. The trail markers faded away, leaving me to follow the faintest of tracks through the underbrush. My GPS kept showing me I was on the right track, so I pushed deeper into the forest, farther than I had ever gone before. I wasn't about to let a few rough trails stop me. The drive for that perfect shot kept pushing me forward, despite the feeling that I was losing my bearings. Hours passed, and the deeper I went, the more the woods began to feel different. The usual sounds of animals and birds became sporadic, and the wind, once gentle, now seemed to blow in odd bursts, rustling the leaves in unsettling ways. I checked the GPS again. It was showing me a location I didn't recognize. It was supposed to be near a clearing, a small rise in the land, but everything around me looked the same. Dark, dense, and unfamiliar. Frustration began to set in. I had come this far, and I wasn't going to turn back empty-handed. I adjusted the strap on my camera bag and pushed forward, the growing unease in my gut ignored by my determination. The map on the GPS blinked, and I could see the dot showing me heading further off the trail. But no matter how much I tried, I couldn't find any landmarks that matched what I was seeing on the screen. I spent another hour circling in search of something familiar, anything that could help me figure out where I was. The sun was starting to sink lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the forest floor. Panic rose in my chest as I realized I had been walking in circles. My water bottle was nearly empty, and I hadn't seen any sign of a trail in what felt like forever. I looked around again, the woods pressing in on me, the trees tall and foreboding, their twisted branches swaying in the growing wind. The thought crossed my mind that I might be lost, but I pushed it aside. The GPS was still guiding me, even if the landmarks didn't match up. I could find it. I had to. The perfect shot was so close I could taste it, and I wasn't about to lose it now. I began moving faster, more desperate now. The anxiety in my chest grew heavier with each step. The sun continued to drop lower, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. I had been hiking for hours now, longer than I had planned, and the exhaustion was beginning to weigh on me. My legs ached, my stomach growled with hunger, and my thoughts were becoming more scattered. But I pushed forward, ignoring the growing dread that gnawed at the back of my mind. I needed to find the pond. As the light started to fade completely, I decided to take a quick break. I sat on a large rock, the cold seeping through my pants as I pulled out my phone again. The GPS showed me a spot not far from where I was sitting, and it seemed to promise that the pond would be just beyond a small thicket of trees. I wasn't about to give up, not now, not when I was so close. With renewed determination, I started again, pushing through the trees, my movements more frantic now. The wind was stronger, howling through the branches above me, and the temperature had dropped significantly. I glanced at my phone. No service. It didn't matter. I was on the right path, I just needed to get there. But no matter how far I walked, how many trees I passed, there was nothing.
No pond. No clearing.
The trees seemed to grow closer together, blocking out what little light remained. The woods had become disorienting, a maze with no way out. I stopped and listened. The only sound now was the wind, whispering through the trees, sounding almost like voices. I shook my head, trying to dispel the thoughts. My phone screen was dimming, and I realized the battery was nearly gone. I cursed under my breath. This wasn't just about the shot anymore. This was about survival. I needed to find my way back. With darkness setting in, I was completely alone in the forest, my anxiety building. I could feel the temperature dropping rapidly, my breath turning into visible clouds. My heart raced as I pushed through the underbrush, my footsteps uneven and panicked. I had no idea where I was, and the deeper I went, the more I felt like the forest was closing in on me. The sounds of the wind in the trees grew louder, the rustling like whispers in my ear, the shadows creeping along the ground like something else was watching me. The trees seemed to stretch impossibly high, their branches like fingers reaching for the sky. I could feel the fear rising in my chest, and no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, my mind kept racing. After what felt like hours of wandering, I stumbled into a small clearing. For a moment, I thought it was the pond, but when I reached the center, there was nothing but a large, overgrown patch of weeds. The GPS still showed me heading toward the pond, but it felt like I was chasing a ghost. My frustration boiled over, and I collapsed onto the ground, my body exhausted and shaking. I was too far gone now. The fear had taken over completely, and the urge to keep moving, to keep trying, felt more like madness than anything else. The darkness was absolute now, the silence deafening. I realized then that the woods weren't just dark because the sun had set. They felt oppressive, like they were pressing in on me, suffocating me. My eyes darted around in the pitch black, the fear of the unknown gnawing at my every thought. I had become obsessed with the idea of reaching this elusive spot, and now I was paying the price. I closed my eyes, trying to steady my breathing. The silence stretched on, and I realized I had nothing left. No more strength, no more hope, just the darkness, the loneliness, and the quiet terror that had crept into my bones. But then, through the trees, I saw something, an outline, a flicker of light. I stumbled toward it, heart racing. The light was faint, but it was there, and it was real. I pushed through the bushes, desperation fueling my movements. The light turned out to be a cabin, small but real. I collapsed in front of it, breathing heavily, the cold air stinging my face. I had found something, anything, after hours of wandering. The door creaked open, and an elderly man appeared, his face lined with years of experience in the wilderness. He looked at me with a mix of surprise and concern but didn't speak. He simply helped me inside, where it was warm and safe. The fire in the cabin's hearth was a welcome sight, and I collapsed into a chair, too exhausted to do anything else. He offered me a drink, and I took it without a word. I could barely speak, my mind too frazzled to form coherent thoughts. He nodded, understanding without words, as though he'd seen others like me before, others who had pushed too far, obsessed with something that didn't matter in the end. The next morning, the man helped me find my way back to the main trail. My car was parked not far from his cabin, and the hike out was a quiet one, the weight of the experience settling in my chest. I never found the pond, and that, in the end, was the perfect shot. Not the one I'd been chasing, but the one I learned about myself. The obsession, the fear, and the realization that some things aren't worth chasing at all. I had been in the woods for hours, but Max still hadn't come back. I stood in the fading light, looking around in confusion. The forest was quiet except for the rustling of leaves in the growing wind. I called for him again, my voice shaking, but the only response was silence. It was getting late. Max usually came back within minutes when I called him. He was always nearby, always good about staying close. But tonight, something felt wrong. The day had started off peaceful enough. I had taken Max, my black lab, out for a hike through the woods near our cabin. I had rented the place for the weekend to escape the noise of the city and recharge. It was secluded, perfect for getting away. I had hoped for some quiet, some peace. The weather was clear, and the sun was still high in the sky when we started our walk. We'd made our way down an old trail that snaked through the woods, following the river as it carved its way through the valley. The scent of pine and damp earth hung heavy in the air, and the sound of the river was calming. Max was running ahead, his tail wagging, always darting in and out of the underbrush, chasing whatever caught his interest. I didn't mind, he was always in sight, always just a few feet away. But after a while, the trail had split, and Max had darted off to chase something. First, I didn't think much of it. I stood still, watching as he disappeared deeper into the woods, his bark echoing through the trees. I waited, thinking he would circle back as usual. But after 5 minutes, then 10, and then 15, I started to feel uneasy. I called his name again, louder this time, but there was no response. Panic started to creep into my chest. I could feel my heart race, the kind of feeling that comes when you know something's wrong but you can't put your finger on it. I stepped off the trail, moving cautiously through the underbrush, calling out for him. The woods seemed different now. I wasn't sure what it was, but something felt off. The trees stood thicker together, and the ground felt soft and uneven beneath my feet. I could still hear the river in the distance, but it didn't sound as close as it had before. I had been walking for what felt like an eternity, and Max still hadn't reappeared. I checked my phone. The screen was cracked, the battery almost dead. I had no signal. My mind began to race, my thoughts scrambling. The sun was starting to set, and the shadows grew longer by the minute. The realization that I might be lost hit me hard, like a punch to the stomach. I hadn't planned on going off the trail this far. I didn't know where I was anymore. I thought about heading back, but where was back? I tried to retrace my steps, but the landscape didn't look familiar. I had no idea how far I had wandered. The trees looked the same in every direction. Every turn I made only seemed to lead me deeper into the forest. The feeling of disorientation hit hard, and with it came a sense of dread. I stopped, taking a deep breath, trying to calm myself. Max was out there somewhere. I knew he was. He wouldn't leave me, and I couldn't leave him. But the more I walked, the more it felt like the woods were swallowing me whole. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves sent a jolt of fear through my body. It wasn't just Max I was worried about anymore. It was myself. I was alone in the darkening woods, far from any trail, with no way to navigate. The thought of being trapped in these woods overnight, with no idea how to get back, was unbearable. I tried calling Max's name again, louder this time, but still no answer. My throat was dry, and my body ached from walking so far. I checked my phone again. The screen blinked once before it died completely. I cursed under my breath. Without the GPS, without any signal, I was completely on my own. The last bit of daylight was quickly fading. I could barely make out the outline of trees in the dim light. My body was starting to feel the effects of exhaustion. I hadn't eaten much that day, just a few granola bars, and my water bottle was almost empty. Panic bubbled up in my chest again, this time more intense. My mind was clouded with fear, but I pushed it aside. I couldn't afford to lose it. Not yet. I had to make a choice. As the light from the setting sun quickly dwindled, I found myself at a crossroads. On one hand, I could keep searching for Max. The thought of leaving him behind, of not finding him, was unbearable. But on the other hand, the idea of being out here all night, possibly much longer, was terrifying. I was cold, tired, and scared. The forest seemed endless, and there was no telling how far I had wandered. The fear of being trapped in the woods overnight, with no shelter, no warmth, no way to know where I was, it was overwhelming. I stood still, weighing my options. I could continue the search, but that would mean heading deeper into the woods in the dark, a place I didn't know, with no way to navigate. Or I could find shelter, find something that could keep me safe for the night, and then search in the morning. I knew I couldn't stay out in the open, exposed to the cold and the wild animals that prowled in the night. The decision tormented me, but I knew I had to be rational. If I didn't find shelter, I might not survive the night. I couldn't help Max if I was dead. I forced myself to turn away from the direction I thought Max might have gone, my stomach heavy with guilt. I stumbled through the trees, my feet aching with every step. The last of the daylight vanished, and the woods grew darker. I could barely see the ground beneath me, and I had to move cautiously to avoid tripping. My heart raced in my chest, but I forced myself to focus on finding shelter. The air was cold now, and a chill ran through me. Finally, I found something, a small, dilapidated shed, tucked in a clearing. It was old, the wood weathered and rotting, but it would do. I rushed inside, slamming the door shut behind me. The shelter was sparse, just a few broken crates and the remnants of old tools scattered around. I sat down on the floor, my back against the wall, trying to catch my breath. I knew the right thing to do was rest. I had to sleep, regain my strength, and then figure out what to do in the morning. But sleep didn't come. My mind kept racing. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined Max out there, alone, lost in the woods just like me. What if he was hurt? What if he was terrified? The thought gnawed at me. I forced myself to lay down, wrapping my arms around my knees, trying to conserve body heat. I couldn't focus on anything else. The sounds of the forest outside were louder now, the wind rustling the trees, the occasional crack of a branch. But in the back of my mind, I heard Max's bark. It echoed, distant but clear, and I thought I saw a flicker of movement in the trees. I had no idea how long I had been laying there, but eventually, sleep overcame me. When I woke, the first light of dawn was just beginning to filter through the cracks in the shed. I stood quickly, heart pounding, and rushed outside. I called Max's name again, this time in desperation. I needed to find him, couldn't let him down. I searched the woods for hours. It felt like forever, but eventually, just as I was about to give up, I heard it, a bark, faint but unmistakable. I followed the sound, moving as quickly as I could through the trees. And then, finally, I saw him, Max, standing at the edge of a small clearing, his tail wagging when he saw me. Relief washed over me, so overwhelming that I nearly collapsed. Max ran to me, and I knelt down to hug him, tears streaming down my face. We had made it through the night, and now we were safe. I led him back to the cabin, every step feeling like a victory. The woods, with all their dangers and their isolation, didn't seem as threatening now. We had made it, together. I learned a lot from that night. It was a reminder that the woods, no matter how beautiful they seem, can be dangerous. It was also a reminder that we are never truly alone, even when it feels like we are. Max had been my guide through the darkness, and in the end, we both found our way home. It was late in the afternoon when I made the decision to leave the marked trail. The thought had been in my mind for a while, and when I saw what looked like a shortcut, I couldn't resist. It wasn't my first hike, not by a long shot, but something about this route drew me in. The sun was still high enough to give me some time before it dipped behind the mountains, and I was convinced that taking the new path would cut down my time to the summit. I had planned a 2-day trek to the top of Mount Mahler, one of the less traveled peaks in the Alps, just outside of Innsbruck. It wasn't a dangerous hike, not by most standards. But here I was, thinking I could shave a few hours off the journey by straying from the beaten path. The air was crisp and the weather clear, perfect hiking conditions. I was feeling good, confident in my experience. The shortcut started as a narrow trail through dense pines, barely noticeable, but enough for me to follow. At first, it didn't seem like a bad idea. I even felt a little smarter, imagining how much time I'd save when I reached the summit early. It was quiet, too quiet, and the sounds of nature, the chirps and calls of birds, filled the space around me. The first hour was easy, but I should have known it wouldn't last. The trail soon began to lose its shape. The path became overgrown with brambles and rocks, and what had seemed like a shortcut now felt like something out of an old, forgotten map. I stopped several times, pulling out my phone to check my location. At first, I blamed it on the dense forest cover, but then I realized there was no signal at all. That was the first sign that I had gone off course, but I dismissed it, thinking it wasn't a big deal. The next town wasn't too far away if I needed help. As I pushed further, the trail grew steeper and more difficult. There was no longer any clear path, and the markers had disappeared. The thick trees and underbrush made the surroundings feel isolated, and as I stumbled over roots and rocks, the once beautiful forest began to feel unsettling. It wasn't just the trail anymore, it was the overwhelming silence. There were no birds, no insects, no rustling in the leaves, just my footsteps crunching against the ground. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, but I pushed on, unwilling to turn back just yet. I told myself it was all in my head. Hours passed, and the day began to wane. The sunlight, which had been so bright earlier, now seemed to be swallowed up by the growing shadows. My legs were sore, and my water bottle was running low. I tried to ignore the growing panic in my chest. I was lost. I could feel it now. The trees around me were no longer familiar, and each direction looked the same. I hadn't seen another person all day. The sense of isolation began to weigh on me. I checked my phone again. Still no signal. My hands started to shake as I realized just how deep into the forest I had gone. I couldn't even hear the sound of a stream or the wind through the trees. It was just stillness. Panic set in as the sky began to turn orange. The sun was sinking lower, and I could feel the temperature dropping with it. I took a deep breath and tried to calm myself. I had to get my bearings. I could still find my way back. I would retrace my steps, but every turn I took, every step forward, seemed to lead to the same dense, unrecognizable forest. I had no choice now. I had to keep moving. If I stopped, I risked losing all hope of finding my way back. I couldn't let the night catch me out here, not with no phone signal, no clear path, and no one around. I thought back to the trail map I had studied before the hike. I knew the summit wasn't too far from where I was, or at least it shouldn't have been. I was certain I hadn't veered that far off course. I was sure the path would reappear, that it was just a matter of time. But the more I searched for it, the more I realized the path was gone. There was no easy way to turn back now. I was alone, deep in a forest, with no real sense of direction. The weight of it started to sink in. The food I had packed would only last me so long, and I hadn't anticipated needing it for more than just a quick snack at the summit. The sun disappeared behind the mountain, and the forest became darker with each passing minute. I stopped to pull out my flashlight, a small beam of light cutting through the thickening darkness. The cold began to seep into my clothes, and I wrapped my jacket tighter around me. There was no way I could make it back now before nightfall. I needed shelter or I would freeze. There was no real path leading anywhere anymore. I had to find a place to rest, to gather my thoughts, and to try to figure out what to do next. I found a small clearing by a boulder and decided it was as good a place as any to wait until morning. There, I took out the last of my food and tried to calm my nerves. The silence of the forest was unbearable now, and the rustling of leaves felt almost unnatural. I checked my phone one more time, praying for a signal, but all I got was a blank screen. The night was long, and it was cold. My body ached from the hours of walking and the growing tension in my chest. I lay on the ground, curled into myself for warmth, trying to ignore the creeping fear that gripped my mind. I told myself that someone would come looking for me, that this was just a rough patch and soon enough, I'd find my way out of this mess. But the hours dragged on, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was too far gone, that no one was coming. The world outside my little patch of light felt vast and unfathomable. I couldn't help but feel small, vulnerable. I thought back to my plans, to reach the summit before nightfall, to complete my hike and head back home. But now that seemed like a foolish dream. I had no idea how to get out. By the time morning came, I was exhausted and delirious. The cold had left me shivering uncontrollably. I knew I couldn't stay in one place for much longer. I had to keep moving despite the exhaustion. My instincts told me that I was close to finding a way out, but my mind was foggy, my body drained. The first rays of light started to pierce through the trees, and I forced myself to stand up. I had no choice but to push on, to take the risk and try to make it through the day. I couldn't waste any more time hoping for rescue. I had to get myself out. I stumbled through the woods, taking careful steps. I wasn't sure where I was going, but I knew I had to keep moving. Every step felt like a monumental effort, but I couldn't stop. I walked for hours, exhausted, thirsty, and hungry. But then, around midday, I spotted something in the distance. It was small, but it was unmistakable, a trail marker. The feeling that surged through me was indescribable. I wasn't entirely lost. I made my way toward it, following the trail markers with newfound hope. It wasn't easy, but the path began to open up again, and I could see the familiar signs of civilization on the horizon. I finally reached a clearing, and there, in front of me, was the main trail I had started on. I had made it back. I didn't stop to rest. I kept moving until I saw other hikers in the distance. They were friendly, but when I tried to tell them my story, all I could do was stare, still in disbelief that I had made it out. That experience changed me. The mountains may be beautiful, but they are also unforgiving. I learned to respect them more than I ever had before. I've been back to the mountains since, but never alone, and I've never strayed from the path again. My instincts, it turns out, were right in the end, but not without a cost. The cost was fear, uncertainty, and the realization that sometimes survival doesn't come from strength or knowledge. It comes from sheer will and a refusal to give up, no matter how dark things get.